Hello, my name is Brian Pitts. I'm the Assistant Director of the Latin American Institute here at UCLA. We want to welcome you to this special lecture that we're having today, which is a co-production of the Latin American Institute and our program in Caribbean Studies with Dr. Olga González-Silén, who is a visiting scholar here at the Latin American Institute. I'm going to go ahead and hand it off to Professor Jorge Martorano of the Department of Spanish and Portuguese, and also Director of our program in Caribbean Studies, who will introduce our speaker and get us underway today. Jorge?
Thank you very much, Brian. First of all, I want to begin with the land acknowledgement that UCLA occupies the ancestral territory of the Gabrielino Tonga people. So I read. The Latin American Institute at UCLA acknowledges our presence on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Gabrielino Tonga people. Second, I want to thank the Latin American Institute for the support of this event, to its director, Rubén Hernández León, to its assistant director, Brian Pitts, and to Ariadne Barrera, who make possible the organization of the event. And to the co-sponsors, the Department of History at UCLA and the Program on Caribbean Studies. And of course, I want to personally thank to our guest speaker, Dr. Olga González-Silén. Olga González-Silén is a historian of Venezuela, Spain, and the United States during the age of the Atlantic Revolution. She received a Ph.D. in history from Harvard University and a BA from Duke University. She taught as a lecturer for 6 years at Cal State, San Marcos, before moving to LA. Her book manuscript examines the connection between the Spanish Supreme Juntas and the province of Caracas during the early years of the War of Spanish Independence. The historian has published 2 journal articles related to this research in the Americas in 2012 and the Hispanic American Historical Review in 2022. In addition, Dr. González-Silén is completing a critical edition of the travel notebook of Philip DePeyster, a New York merchant who traded in the Caribbean in the early 19th century. From late 2018 to early 2020, she tweeted a multimedia edition of the diary in real time and Peyster 1812. This edition introduced a scholar and a larger public to a unique testimony of Venezuela's first Republican experiment. Her scholarship has been recognized nationally. Most notably, the historian was the recipient of the Andrew Mellon Fellowship in the Humanities in 2003 and was awarded the Tivesar Prize by the Conference of Latin American History in 2012. We will welcome Dr. González-Silén at UCLA. Her presentation is entitled Diary of a New York Merchant in the Age of Revolutions, Philip DePeyster in Venezuela First Republic. Thank you, Olga.
Okay, thank you. First of all, good afternoon. I want to thank the UCLA Latin American Institute, especially Brian Pitts, who invited me, the UCLA History Department, and the UCLA Program on Caribbean Studies for the invitation. Also, thank you for this wonderful introduction. I'm thrilled and honored to be here today with you. Okay, today, I'm going to talk about my project centered on one historical source, Philip DePeyster Travel Notebook. This New York merchant first used the notebook to record his travel in accounting. Oh, sorry, 1 second. Let me just, wait, 1 second. Okay. So, yes, sorry. So Philip DePeyster first used the notebook to record his travel in accounting beginning in 1806. The notebook contains the accounting of 3 different trips. It is only in the 3rd trip in November 1811 when DePeyster turned, he literally flipped around the notebook to begin writing a travel diary that covers his entire journey, 14 months, from November 1811 to February 1813. 1 second. no. Okay. So this is actually the first page of his diary, and it's like a memo to jot the memory of, to tell the tale of this trip. So my goal today is to show you why this modest brown leather notebook offers an exciting point of entry to learn about the age of Atlantic revolutions. First, though, I must ask for your understanding, maybe your forgiveness, because I'm going to retrace how my visit to one archive evolved into, the list is long, an idea of an academic book, a translation into Spanish, 2 conference presentations, a multimedia edition of the notebook on Twitter, an online community of supporters, an in-depth biography of an incredibly obscure New York merchant, and ultimately, a manuscript of an annotated edition of the notebook in Spanish. Okay, let's begin. A long time ago, in a galaxy far, far away, I was doing research for my dissertation in the New York Historical Society. Checking their online catalog, I had seen a promising entry about a diary that chronicled the 1812 Venezuelan earthquake. So this is not a document that was lost. And here I want to just thank, like every day I do, librarians and archivists, because the entry had a beautiful description as to what this document was. Once in the Historical Society, though, I could not believe my eyes when I began to read the notebook. This historical source is an extremely rare, even unique look into the mythical Venezuela First Republic. Think of the Venezuelan First Republic as a period akin to 1776 with 2 caveats. Imagine if the American Revolution had failed spectacularly in 1777, shortly after a devastating earthquake. So, like Venezuelan historians in the last 2 centuries have managed to collect a lot of the sources, but due to the long wars of independence and the earthquake and, the complete chaos, the Republic's record is very spotty and fragmentary. That is why it is hard to overstate the value of the DePeyster notebook for Venezuelan history. I was sad when I decided to focus my dissertation on the outbreak of Spanish-American independence, because this meant I had to leave out the notebook. I have always believed strongly that this notebook needed to be published, but I was not always certain whether it should be by me. I was very, very reluctant to volunteer because I was at the beginning of writing my dissertation, and soon after I will have 2 babies. So, of course, this was a pretty large project. So what I decided to do was to think of the DePeyster notebook as my hobby. This is like craziness of historians, anyways, and in my crazy plan, I was gonna dedicate 1 week a year to work on this hobby. And I actually did, for a decade, dedicate 1 year to the DePeyster project. Of course, this project is a hobby that got completely out of hand. If not, I wouldn't be here. After 15 years, what began as a narrow documentary project about Republican Venezuela have become a reflection on US merchants, New York City, the Dutch Atlantic, the 1812 Anglo-American War, the American Enlightenment, and the early American Republic. I didn't begin, okay. Okay, let's go back to my research trip in the mid-2000s. At the time, I photographed the notebook and shortly thereafter transcribed it. A few years later, my friend Edward Pompeyan gave me his pictures that were way better, and we actually shared transcriptions. For about a decade, my once-a-year hobby consisted mostly of collecting sources about DePeyster. The crazy thing to me was that I kept on finding sources and more sources and more sources about a merchant who was, by all measures, a very minor and obscure figure. So why were there so many sources about Philip DePeyster? I have three answers. The first one is that the extended DePeyster family is a very well-known New York family since the Dutch founding of New Amsterdam in the 17th century. There are books about the DePeyster, there are articles, there are beautiful genealogies, very, very detailed, hundreds of pages. There are archival collections. And here I have included a picture of New York City in the late 18th century. And I want you to notice that this is just kind of like a very small city. The city is about to explode in the early 19th century. But so in this very small city, the DePeysters have been around in all sorts of positions for, almost 200 years. The second reason why there were so many papers is that Philip was appointed the US consul to the Dutch island of Curacao in 1806, and he was appointed again to be the US consul to the French island of Guadeloupe in 1816. So there are many government sources. There are, he appears in the Congress records, he appears in Founding Fathers records, he's in the State Department records, in the diplomatic dispatches. And here I included a photo of like a transcribed letter in Founders Online. The third reason was there were so many papers about DePeyster, and perhaps to me the most interesting one is that Philip's sister, Elizabeth DePeyster, married Charles Wilson Peel, one of the leading figures of the American Enlightenment. Peel was friends with Thomas Jefferson and the Baron von Humboldt. And he was a portrait painter, an inventor, and museum founder, discovered a mastodon. I mean, this is like an incredible, interesting character. For almost 3 decades, Peel forced his family-in-law, especially the DePeyster brothers, mostly John DePeyster, but a few letters from Philip also, to write to him. So we actually have like a 30-year span of around 150 letters. So, these letters are beautiful, there is like all sorts of details, sad, happy, you see life evolving for 3 decades for the extended DePeyster family. Sorry, I have to take the paper and instead I pass the thing. Okay. Doing a slow history is really fun, but it's not a very good way to move a project forward. In this regard, my late father gave me a big push. At some point, I felt he needed to have like a hobby also. So I asked him to translate the notebook into Spanish, which he did. He then became a huge fan of who he called our friend Philip and wanted us to write a movie script based on his diary. I mean, he was convinced that this would be like a great Hollywood adventure. His reaction was surprising, yeah, because without this historical training, it is a little bit hard to get into a historical into primary sources. But since then, I have seen many readers develop a really strong bond with our friend Philip. And I have a theory here. Philip wrote the diary to be read aloud to his family members. The effect is dramatic. When you read the diary, it seems as if Philip DePeyster is talking to you directly about his adventures. So let me give you an example of this really cinematic, personal style in which the diary is written. So I'm gonna read the entry, the opening of like a really, really long entry on the day of the 1812 Venezuelan earthquake. March 26, 1812. So this is DePeyster. About 4 o'clock, while yet at the table waiting for coffee, we were about 10 in number. The bottles and glasses began to jingle, and we felt a violent motion. Each thought that it was a foolish trick of his neighbor, but we soon discovered by the piercing shrieks in the street and by the judicious guess of a Yankee that it was an earthquake. All left the house on the whole. The agitation of the earth was such that I was nearly thrown. 2 of the company actually fell. Our house forms a hollow square. In the middle of that square, we waited our doom. We waited not long before the wreck of houses and the crush of things took place, and we were completely enveloped in a cloud of dust. The German Baron de Schack uttered a "Good God." I mean, like he just tried to do like a German accent. I mean, like with my accent over my accent over my accent, maybe it didn't work, but "Good God," and threw his arms around my neck as if I could save him. I shook him off with a "God damn your soul, let me go, give us a chance." And I ran into a backyard where at least I was safe from the wreckage. This was certainly not the most appropriate time for swearing, but I was in a hurry and had no time to think before I spoke. One second, let me pass the page. The diary is packed with all sorts of episodes from beginning to end, really, that illuminate the age of Atlantic revolutions in a very personal way. Let me share some highlights of the diary. Okay, first, the diary allows the readers to feel the excitement of arriving to the Confederacy of Venezuela, a newly founded republic in the Americas in 1812. While trying to sell and buy commodities, Philip DePeyster participated in the noble community of foreigners. Remember, the Spanish Empire didn't allow foreigners to settle in Spanish America. And he also, in his daily life, happened to run into many leading revolutionaries. So, you know, his diary is a little bit like a Forrest Gump, you know, that he just kind of all these different people pop. Well, the second highlight is that the diary also allows the reader to empathize with the incredible desperation that followed the 1812 Venezuelan earthquake. I mean, we're talking about thousands of people dying. This tragedy became the United States' first humanitarian aid mission. So DePeyster recorded the mission, but an interesting thing that he also did is that he recorded not only the earthquake, but its continuous aftershocks all the way till November with great details. And, you know, why did he do that? And I suspect it's because, you know, this was valuable information for natural history. And DePeyster was very close to Peel. So, you know, perhaps he wanted to keep a record for this reason. The third highlight is that the diary includes a battle with cannonballs flying on top of people's heads. So, I mean, this is just, it's actually serious and probably horrible, but, you know, he makes it look like it's the most fun thing ever to be shot by cannonballs if they miss. In July 1812, once the Venezuelan Confederacy surrendered to the Spanish forces, DePeyster was in one of the foreign ships that attempted to escape the port of La Guaira, but he did not succeed. So that's why he actually had to stay till November. The final highlight, I believe, of the diary is its vivid depictions of what it entailed to navigate the Caribbean during the 1812 Anglo-American War, that some of you might know as the 1812 War. In the diary, there was a mutiny, several privateer boardings, a brief detention by the Royal Navy, an almost miss of a coral reef, and finally, the last entry is about a gush of wind that destroyed the schooner that brought Philip and one of the leading Venezuelan revolutionaries to South Carolina. Oh, sorry. So that's, in this slide, you have the first Venezuelan constitution. So that's the Constitution of 1812. So this is a very pivotal moment of break between colonial Venezuela, between the Spanish America, and the first republic, one of the earliest republics in Latin America. And here I have included a slide in which we see a naval confrontation in the War of 1812 between a US ship and a British ship. You know, and I think it's really like remarkable how difficult it was to travel the Caribbean at this moment of intense war between America, between the United States and Great Britain. Okay. Okay, so let me first stay here for a little. Now that you have a taste of the diary, let's return to the history of this project. Once I finally committed to publish the DePeyster notebook, when I said, no, it has to be me, I have to do this. My academic training, you know, I have a PhD in history, kicked in. And I began to look for a big argument, an argument to write a scholarly essay to serve as an introduction. You know, in a way, I thought of it that I needed an argument to justify my investment as an academic. In 2015, I presented a hot mess of a paper in rank class about all that I knew about Philip DePeyster. My colleagues were very gracious, and you know, the most interested seemed to be about his role as a US consul. So, you know, he's like in the first years of US consuls. So in 2017, I presented at the AHA about the pioneering role of merchants like Philip DePeyster in establishing the US diplomacy of ports in the Caribbean. Okay, so now I have to go back to the document. It was time to modernize the notebook's original transcription. And I did this partly because initially I thought this was going to be a bilingual edition, but after I did all of the work, I decided that it makes more sense just to do like a Spanish edition. But anyways, I modernized the original transcription, and I revised my father's Spanish translation. These tasks were insanely boring. You know, I mean, it's just not something I had done before, and it requires, I'm not, well, now I'm better, but you know, this requires a lot of attention to detail and, you know, like a lot of knowledge about language. Anyways, it was very boring. So I came up with an idea to make myself do it. And this was to create endless small deadlines. How? Well, I decided I was going to create a Twitter account for Philip DePeyster, and I was going to tweet the diary in real time for 14 months. So if he began on November 1811, I began tweeting in November 1811. So the day he wrote, the day it posted. And this was really a neat experiment because I feel personally as a historian that I got to feel like the rhythm of the era in a way that you don't really get it when you just read it in one go. So to create each tweet, I follow this task list. 1 second. Okay, no, actually, let me backtrack a little bit. So this is what a small tweet, a very small entry will look like. So it's Philip DePeyster, and you know, it has the date, December 2nd, 1811, and you know, he just said that day on Sunday, I arrived to St. Barth without mishaps. So that's what you saw in the diary, no? And this is what I did to create that entry. Oh. Okay. So let me move it here a little bit. And let me just minimize this. Okay, so the nice thing about doing this project was how to rethink the trace of historians into this new format. So for example, sometimes underneath it, if you see this entry, the main entry, I decided to make an explanation as to why he arrived to St. Barth. Because it's a very important explanation, you know, it's one of the few ports still open to US commerce. So I explained the argument of a particular historian, Victor Wilson, and actually his dissertation is online. So in the next tweet, I actually said, if you want to learn more, you can go to this dissertation. At other times in the experience of this Twitter account, I created key context, for example, about the Venezuelan earthquake. And what I would do is I will retweet, using Philip DePeyster's account, I will retweet myself. So in the timeline, you will see me, the historian, introducing you to a major point, a major context that you needed to understand. And throughout the essays, throughout the different entries, for example, I also said, this is the most important book. I will put pages, or I did fun things. Like one time he was looking at the stars and I found like what the stars looked that day. One time he said, I listened to this beautiful music and I put a video of a Venezuelan colonial music. So that was really, really fun. But let me show you. Actually, did I miss one? No. Oh, okay. I kept on looking for a slide and I was like, where is it? Okay. To create this tweet, these are the deadlines that I was talking about. I checked the original transcription. So, you know, of course I had an initial one. It's a little bit hard to transcribe, you know, there is like a lot of shorthands and things like that. And, you know, it's handwritten. There is literally no commas or periods. So I took the opportunity to check the original transcription. And I also took the opportunity to check my dad's translation. I modernized the English. Then I did a second translation, a second round of translation. And then with that, once that was done, which is what I needed for the book, I created a Twitter edition because obviously, you know, in Twitter, you need to use like a smaller space and, you know, so I caught a few things. So I also created, and here you can see the different documents as they evolve. And for the book, I actually did a really long third round of translations, and I think I'm done. Okay, that's where this slide was. Okay, so after I did all that, like I showed you, I find the illustrations and I created the entry, and I created all this context that actually I end up using also in the book. So it was very, very useful. So the best part of the account of Philip DePeyster was actually, this was really fun, but was actually the community that grew around the Twitter edition. So it was very interactive. Followers asked questions, left comments, and engaged deeply with the history of the Atlantic world. By the end, the account had over 1,000 followers. I think now it's like 1,200 or something like that. And if anyone of you know who you are, the people who really follow this is here. I just cannot even begin to express my gratitude by the support and continued support that I keep on receiving from this community. And, you know, it's really one of motivation to finish this project is because I know there's a few people who really want to read this book, and that's very exciting. So the Twitter experience changed the course of the DePeyster project. Oh, 1 second. Okay, sorry. Like, and I wanted to show how important. Initially, I thought of like the book, you know, and I have like a first edition here. I thought of the book as the important one, but actually now I think probably it's gonna be the opposite way, that the Twitter account was the important one and the book less. And one of the nice things about Twitter is, for example, when he was sick and he took medicines, I could go back to an 1815 book and just provide like what the medicine would contain. I could use maps to show the geography of the trip. When DePeyster mentions what he's trying to buy, which are like the main products from Venezuela, colonial Venezuela, you can put images. So, you know, it is, I guess Twitter feels a little fleeting, but at the same time, you know, like this multimedia dimension is really appealing for a history project. Okay, let me continue here before I move on. The Twitter experience changed the course of the DePeyster project. So my goal now was for the book to bridge the divide between an academic and a general audience. So the academic part of the book comes naturally to me. You know, you will find tons of footnotes, you will find 4 different indexes, a few annex documents, you know, like I think for historians, they will really like, I have put a lot of attention to recreate the accounting, which has tremendous information, and the accounting didn't really translate to Twitter. But in addition to that, I have tried to apply the lessons that I learned from the Twitter edition to the print edition. To do so, I asked myself continuously while I was writing it, what do non-academic readers need to connect to this primary source? You know, and also, how can I do this without being too much in the middle? So this has been like a really interesting project. So this change led me to one of the hardest choices, which was scratching the essay on the pioneering role of US consuls in the Caribbean. So this idea of having one big, really important and significant argument, I thought was not as appealing, and I thought it wasn't the best way to use the time and attention that the reader who is about to read the diary needs. So the book now opens with an in-depth biographical essay of Philip DePeyster. The biography, I must confess, seems old-fashioned. It's superficially, but I hope it's not. I don't think it is. Using a narrative framework, I try to weave together many small arguments, or I guess, you know, like they're not that developed in, but, you know, like, or ideas of arguments about what it meant to be a New York merchant, a US citizen, a lover of natural history, and a witness to the age of Atlantic revolutions. Okay, let me see how we're doing in time. Okay. We're going back to this picture a little bit because, you know, I think it's very important to conceptualize the biography. So I think to conclude this presentation of the DePeyster project, I want to highlight a few points from the biography that are interesting. Why is this biography transcend a little bit Philip DePeyster? You know, what can it tell us? Okay. Having born in 1772, so I mean, almost during the American Revolution, in the midst of the American Revolution, really, the life of Philip DePeyster embodied the promises and setbacks of the early American Republic, especially of the US policy of neutral commerce. The DePeyster brothers, who were, using the terminology of Katie Mason, middling merchants, attempted to profit from neutral commerce both in Europe and the Caribbean. The account shows how difficult this became at the beginning of the 19th century, with the DePeysters actually declaring bankruptcy soon after Philip returns from Venezuela. The second conclusion from the essay is how the life of Philip DePeyster illustrates the continuities with the colonial past. And I'm not talking about only like just before the revolution, but actually all the way to the 17th century. After several generations, Philip spoke Low Dutch, belonged to the Dutch Reformed Church, and traded in the Dutch Caribbean. In retrospect, he was a transitional figure. He was born in a New York City that is still retained the contours of the colonial city. So very similar to the map that we see in this slide. And what I saw is how the families changing addresses, you know, from Lower Manhattan to Uptown to the East, and eventually the DePeysters end up in Hoboken, New Jersey, signal the end of an era for the old merchant families. You know, wealth is growing increasingly unequal, you know, and we see here how some merchants kind of fall down the social hierarchy, while others, there are all sorts of strategies to belong to this new elite of an exploding New York City. It is worth noting that the DePeysters' Hoboken farm was an old land concession that dated back from the Dutch settlers. You know, these Hoboken concessions were inherited by these Dutch families. The third conclusion that I think this essay brings to the table is how Philip DePeyster was a minor participant of the American Enlightenment. When Elizabeth DePeyster and Charles Wilson Peel married, Peel had just opened his Philadelphia museum. And actually, this is a self-portrait of Charles Wilson Peel, and he's raising a curtain showing you all the things that you can see in this private, you know, the Philadelphia Museum was his private museum where he had his portraits and an incredibly large collection of natural history. So in a democratic twist, Peel had invited everyone to send specimens to the museum. For decades, Philip collected specimens, you know, especially actually from Venezuela and Curacao, and send them to his brother-in-law in Philadelphia. So it's when Philip goes to Europe, he actually goes to check out all of the natural history exhibits and reports back that, you know, Peel's exhibits are really top-notch. And the fourth conclusion, I guess, that you can see from this biography is that Philip DePeyster was a disaster of a U.S. consul. He was a complete failure, not just the circumstances. You know, when he was appointed to a place, the place will have a war and authorities will change. But nonetheless, what his history of becoming a U.S. consul and what he does when he's a consul shows is the entrepreneurial spirit in which U.S. citizens came to the new Latin American republics in this dual role as merchants and representatives of the United States. And here I want to recommend the recent book of my friend Edward Pompeian, Sustaining Empire, Venezuela's Trade with the United States During the Age of Revolution, that came out this month by Johns Hopkins University Press. Okay, at this point, we arrive at the present with the DePeyster Notebook Twitter edition completed and a book manuscript ready to go to the publishers. Okay, I will say overall not bad for a hobby. Okay, so I look forward to your questions and comments. And oh, okay, and let me 1 second see how I get out of this. Okay. Okay. Let me stop sharing the screen and bring people back. Okay, and then how do I stop sharing the screen? I'm not quite sure. But anyways, so
thank you.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Olga, for a really fascinating project, no, and incredible work, no. So it's amazing, no. Thank you for, so much for sharing this with us. No, so I have a couple of questions. No, but one, no, you answer, no, it in the you answered it at the end, no, about, no, that I think is a very interesting thing, no, this idea, no, of the merchants at the origin of diplomatic ties, no, with Latin America. So my question is this, no, is when this began to change, no? So and if it ever changed, no, at which point the merchants began to be replaced by professional politicians and so on?
Well, you know what? I must say that I only have seen the first half of the 19th century. And I actually, mostly I have seen this first decade. So let me kind of move it a little bit to what I know best. So who are the first representatives in Latin America? So when the republics, when Spanish American independence begins, the United States actually sent 3 agents. And these 3 agents are actually, 2 of them are very, very political. So, you know, I think one is Joel Ponset, that eventually will be like the consul in Mexico, and Ponsetias from the Flowers. The other is a Shell guy, which, you know, I don't remember the details. So they sent 2 very political agents to kind of figure out what is going on in Latin American independence. And the third one is the council that they sent to La Guaira. And he's kind of a transitional figure. And this is the figure that my friend Edward Pompeyan studied. He is very, very political, but at the same time, he represents the interests of the Baltimore merchants. You know, and actually it's not like they represent the United States. The merchants in the US were like the New York merchants and the Baltimore merchants. They acted as small corporations. So, so we have these 3 like very political agents at the outbreak of independence. And I think we have people like DePeyster, who was not interested in being a political agent. You know, and in reality, if you read the rules for councils, the rules are like, if a merchant dies in a foreign port, if sailors are stranded. So the political agents are like trying to figure out independence. And then you have people like Philip, who what he wants to do is to move to a port and just being like the big dog there. Maybe send a few reports, like political reports, but it's mostly like a mercantile advantage. And actually we see like a relative of him later on, like maybe 15 years later, getting a consulate post in Brazil also. So in the diary, Philip befriended the consul, but we actually see him, of course, La Guaira already have a consul, but Puerto Cabello, that is the second port in Venezuela, doesn't. And there was a figure of vice consul. So what Philip does is he actually goes and explores Puerto Cabello. I mean, he doesn't say it, but suggesting that perhaps, and actually the Council of La Guaira suggests that they needed a vice consul in Puerto Cabello. So I think there is always like at least in these first decades, there is a tension between gaining a trading advantage. Well, and this is an important part. The figure of consuls didn't have a salary. You had no salary. So and that's probably, if I have to guess, it would be important to see when they start being paid, because the consuls were supposed to support themselves by fees for services. So let's say like someone in that country did something to you that you lost money, and then the United States is gonna like have a reclamation. the consul will like write it down, and then you will have to pay him a little. So, you know, there is that part of not being paid a salary that I think, you know, makes this very murky, you know.
Thank you very much, Olga. Brian?
It looks like we have a couple of questions open in the Q&A right now. So the first one is from Maria Barbara Cepeda Cortez, who says, thank you so much for your wonderful talk. My question is about the role of American merchants in Venezuela's First Republic. Did they participate in meaningful ways beyond incisive observation of historical change? Did they influence or support those who fought for the Republic? Did they take sides? Because I imagine this is a highly politicized period, which I think is a little bit related to the question that Jorge just posed. But if there's anything additional you wanted to add to that.
Yes, you know, I think it varies by degree, but very much you have to be kind of an enthusiast of the Republic. You know, I think DePeyster was kind of like a nice guy. So he was, you know, actually he was kind of like, well, I don't know, with people of all these different races, you know, they're very nice, but I don't know what. But there are a lot of merchants who take a strong position. And this has to do also with competitions among merchants for favorable trade. For example, the Republic give favorable trade to the British, you know, and the British merchants seem to have an advantage. So we also have kind of, yes, like they have to be intensely related to, and for example, DePeyster is hanging out with like high society Venezuelan girls, you know, and this is also, you know, some of them get married to Venezuelan girls. So there is like a lot of things going on, but there is also, I think it's an interesting thing. They're also representative of these larger struggles among powers, you know, among British and, you know, Dutch. You know, at some point, Philip also represented the Dutch interest, no? Because Philip's main contact is Curacao. You know, and actually the DePeysters still have family in Curacao, and, you know, there have been some marriages back and forth. And Philip is there selling a shipment from a Curacao merchant. So we do have Dutch, British, French, and American and US merchants. So, you know, yes, it's complicated.
Thank you.
I could imagine that in general, that usually, at least from the perspective of the U.S. governments, at least, the perspective would have generally been supportive of republicanism and of independence, right? As sort of like matching up with both, you know, sort of American and anti-monarchical, so like American attitudes that are against a monarchy and favor republic, and also being more favorable for U.S. trade in the region. But I guess I'm wondering, like, to what extent did this filter down to American merchants, right? Do they take a position, you know, in favor of or opposed to republicanism because this is the position of their government, or their interest much more mundane, related to what they're related to their, you know, to their profits and to their own personal interest in the region?
You know, actually, you will be surprised. The position of the U.S. is one of great ambivalence. And this has to do with the fact that it's actually my serious work that, you know, Great Britain is supporting Spain. So technically they are strong allies. So if the United States recognize officially the new Latin American republics, it will be joining sides, you know. So this is kind of like the policy of neutral commerce is very tricky, and it has to do with all of these, like there's so many factors, you know. It's like their nation, it's how these European empires are all alike and changing, you know. The British were against the Spanish, but then they're with the Spanish against the French, and the French conquer the Dutch islands, you know, and what about the French islands? So I think the United States is very ambivalent, because the position was like, why to recognize them if we could maybe exploit them without recognizing them? So they are encouraging them, but at the same time, they are not committing. So, you know, that's what I say, like the framework we have to take is kind of like the bigger Napoleonic Wars. And this idea of neutrality is a very strong principle in the United States, you know. So yes, support, but at the same time, not enough support, or, you know, like support that. And the reality was like, are these republics going to succeed? I mean, why to even support them if we don't know if they're going to succeed? If we support them, then Spain, we're against Spain and Great Britain. And Great Britain also kind of supported, but they couldn't really support it. And individual officials in the islands, because, you know, Venezuela is surrounded by all these different islands. The British islands initially are very, very supportive. And then Great Britain changed the functionaries. And it's like, no, we cannot be this supportive. So, you know, there is like a lot of moving pieces. So I don't know where I'm explaining it or not. But I mean, if you're confused, I feel like that's kind of the sentiment, you know, that was at that period. It's very politically very complex.
Thank you, Olga. Bikram Tambole thank you for he says thank you for an interesting presentation. We would like to know a little more about the Peel collection, what he collected and where is the collection now?
The Charles Wilson Peel papers were collected. I think a lot of them are in Philadelphia, if I'm right. But Yale University Press did an incredible editorial work putting together the selected papers of Peel, which is a few thousand pages in many volumes. And then, and some of the letters are there, but they also created a microform collection of everything they could find. And many of the letters of the DePeyster, which I guess will fall in like maybe less interesting letters. I mean, some of them are interesting and they're in the selected paper published, are in the microform. And the microform, as I say, eventually I got over 150 letters, and you know, they're really interesting. They are, Elizabeth died in childbirth. Actually, you know, there is like a letter of 2 pages about how when she had this still baby, like, I mean, it's like really like he was a very sentimental person. Elizabeth was his second wife. He was a much older man. And this is kind of interesting about the DePeyster family. The Elizabeth and I forgot the name of the other sister. Oh, Margaret. They both married much older guys who were leading figures in the American Revolution. And they actually moved to be second wives of this man to Philadelphia. So the DePeyster family, while it was like a relatively modest merchant family, had these incredible connections. Margaret married a guy who was the secretary of George Washington. So anyways, I know so much. I mean, I know that Philip's mother also died in childbirth, but I know that the woman who was Philip's mom raised him with a lot of love. I mean, so it's like a little bit weird. So I had 30 years of how are the children. Here I found shell collection in New York that they're selling, and I went to check it out to see whether you want it. So, or when the DePeysters built a new house uptown, Peel was a huge inventor. So he invented like a new way of heating and a new way of ironing. So there's all these letters about how to build, you know, the heating and the, so I don't know, like, I'm just trying to give you a sense as to the DePeysters are a very minor subject in like the Peel collection. But, you know, in reality, in his papers, they're a big part of his family. There is a famous quote of Peel talking about the Baron von Humboldt, and you will see this quote in a lot of websites. And that's actually a quote that he wrote to his brother, so his brothers-in-law, to John DePeyster, Philip's brother. So it's interesting, you know, that how I found that information.
Thank you. Robin Derby and Vikram are wondering, we were also curious about the types of notes he made about the British smugglers, merchants, and if he made comment on the Pons, another traveler to the region.
Well, he made about the British smugglers, merchants. Well, you know what? It's interesting. So I don't think he saw himself, he had that distinction between merchants and smugglers, because when you go to the accounting, he had already been smuggling in Venezuela twice, you know. So actually, the second trip is interesting. He goes all over the region for a year. So he had already been in Cumaná in 1806. He had already been to Coro in 1810. So, and they were profitable, you know, like they were profitable. In Coro he sold corn, and in Cumaná he said flour. So he had already been a smuggler merchant, although I don't think he would see himself that way, but that's what he was doing. And I think all the people that he hung out, and actually in Caracas, he find a lot of merchants he had already met through the Caribbean and New York, you know, so that's interesting too. Like he said, oh, this guy was with me in a boarding house in Guadalupe. Oh, this guy is the son of the, like the shopkeeper in New York. So I don't know whether, so he's hanging out with this community of merchants. So there is a lot of interesting small comments about this. I think in the accounting, which is hard to, you know, if you're not a historian, I think the accounting will be wrong. So what I try to do is I give like a small page of like reconstructing the accounting story to open each accounting section. So in the accounting, there is a lot of that information. So he makes a comment on the Pons. He doesn't make a comment on the Pons, but he makes a comment about William Burke. And William Burke is really, really famous in Venezuelan history. In the main newspaper in Venezuela in 1811, there was published a discussion of religious tolerance that was incredibly controversial, you know, by a William Burke, you know, like a Scottish, I think it's Scottish, well, but a Scottish person that, you know, didn't leave much stress. So like he came to Venezuela, published these editorials that were incredibly controversial about religious tolerance. And we see many comments about religious intolerance a few amount in the diary, especially after the earthquake, because people are saying, God punish us because we allowed you Protestants to come to Venezuela. So what is interesting is this William Burke figure is a very mysterious figure in Venezuelan history, but he's all over, you know, like there is like a whole section in which DePeyster hang out with William Burke. And so a person wrote a book saying, you know, William Burke was actually Francisco de Miranda, that he just happened to write under the name of William Burke because, you know, it was too controversial. And in the diary, we actually learn things like William Burke. Oh, so after the earthquake, a lot of the foreigners leave the city. You know, I mean, the city is completely, it's like massively destroyed, hundreds of people dead. So the foreigners actually leave the city thinking, you know, like there is going to be disease and, you know, there is like a lot of anti-foreign sentiment. And they create the Earthquake Society. And one of the members is William Burke. And we learn things like he was very lazy, but he was very gluttonous. So, you know, one of the nice things is that this diary, my friend Guillermo Veledo, I gave him an early version of the essay and he has quoted already, cited it already. So this is a proof that William Burke was a real person. And actually I found in an American newspaper, the report that William Burke did about the earthquake. So that's one of the annex documents. You know, the report is really boring, but, you know, it's also interesting because after the earthquake, when there's this idea that God is punishing Venezuela, you know, like the enemies of the republic are like, well, obviously, if you become Republican, you know, that's what God does. He kills you. So one of the things that the government does, and then in the mountain, if you go to Caracas, between Caracas and La Guaira, there is a huge mountain. They are seeing these clouds of dust. So people say, well, not only there was an earthquake, but the mountain is a volcano that is about to explode. So there is this panic about a volcano. So one of the things that the government does is that it sends William Burke to the mountain to write a report to whether the mountain was a volcano or not. And, you know, this is part of the diary. You know, the diary is like, oh, he left, he came back. There are the rumors of that. And then in a US magazine, I found a report of William Burke about, and so that's an annex. So yes, I mean, there is, I wish there's a lot, but, you know, of course there is just as he's moving through the world, you know, with his blinkers. So, you know, he's more interested about commerce. So, you know, you will see a lot of, and then, yes, so that's the answer.
Thank you. Eva, my connection is breaking up a little, no? So there is a couple of more things, no? First, no, which is the, and if there is a connection, a Mason connection, and the other is that, that also by Bikram, no, Luis Castro Leiva has written about other kinds of political imaginaries at this time in Venezuela, beyond republicanism. I wonder if DePeyster has any opinion about these other political projects.
So DePeyster, he's kind of your run-of-the-mill, kind of mildly interested political person, you know, so he doesn't, I think if you read his political comments are kind of, you know, the racist stereotypes of the era, kind of the idea of the republic, whether republics have to be homogeneous, how big republics can be. And in reality, you know, more than half of his journey, he's under the Spanish authorities. So it's interesting. He definitely did not like the Spanish authorities because, you know, he's forced to remain in Venezuela for an extended period of time. So yeah, I think it is useful to read him and you will find some quotes, but I don't think, for example, he also makes comments about Gregor MacGregor, which is this Scottish person, revolutionary, who, you know, was incredibly important during the Venezuelan Wars of Revolution, and married a woman from Caracas, and, you know, was recognized by Simon Bolivar. And he's kind of like saying, well, you know, this guy's like a crazy person, you know, he wears like a skirt, and, you know, he's like a populist, and, you know, he's just like making like the lower classes are like happy. So, you know, in that sense, you actually kind of are following his story, you know. So yeah, I know, like, I wish he sometimes I'm like, dude, couldn't you have written about this thing? But, you know, you are kind of following him along, you know. And that's why it's important to have his biography, because I think once you learn about him, a lot of the diary starts making more sense.
Thank you very much. Brian, I think we should, nearing the end of the event.
Almost in say, huh? All right, well,
I don't know if you have any question.
No, I asked my question that I had. So if there aren't any further questions from the audience, we are at an hour, which is about how long we go with all these events. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us, specifically to Dr. González-Silén. It's been a real pleasure, especially from the point of view of a historian myself, and not getting to hear a lot of talks from history these days. It's been a real pleasure to have you. And I look forward to seeing you more around the Latin American Institutes. in person in the coming weeks. For the rest of you, we are nearing the end of our programming for this academic year. However, you can check out our Facebook, or our website to find out more about the events that we have coming up. And of course, we'll have a full slate of events starting again when the new academic year begins in October. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. Jorge, thank you so much for moderating today. Ariadne, thank you so much for being at the controls and keeping all the tech running smoothly. And everyone, have a great afternoon.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Olga. Bye.
Bye.